Purgatory, Part 4. Chapter 23. Duration of Purgatory. The Cistercian Abbot and Pope Innocent III, Jean de Liere. In the life of Saint Lugarda, written by her contemporary, Thomas de Kentempre, mention is made of a religious who was otherwise fervent, but who for an excess of zeal was condemned to the 40 years of purgatory. This was an abbot of the Cistercian order named Simon, who held St. Lugarda in great veneration. The saint, on her part, willingly followed his advice, and in consequence a sort of spiritual friendship was formed between them. But the abbot was not as mild towards his subordinates as he was towards the saint. Severe with himself, he was also severe in his administration, and carried his exactions in matters of discipline even to harshness, forgetting the lesson of the divine Master, who teaches us to be meek and humble of heart. Having died, and whilst Saint Lugarda was fervently praying and imposing penances on herself for the repose of his soul, he appeared to her, and declared that he was condemned to 40 years of purgatory. Fortunately, he had in Lugarda a generous and powerful friend. She redoubled her prayers and austerities, and having received from God the assurance that the departed soul should soon be delivered, the charitable state replied, quote, "I will not cease to weep. I will not cease to importune your mercy until I see him freed from his pains." Unquote. Since I am mentioning St. Lugarda, art I to speak of the celebrated apparition of Pope Innocent III? I acknowledge the perusal of this incident shocked me, and I would fain pass it over in silence. I was reluctant to think that a pope, and such a pope, had been condemned to so long and terrible a purgatory. We know that Innocent III, who presided over at the celebrated Council of Lateran in 1215, was one of the greatest pontiffs who ever filled the chair of St. Peter. His piety and zeal led him to accomplish great things for the Church of God and holy discipline. How, then, admit that such a man was judged with so great severity as the Supreme Tribunal? How reconcile this revelation of St. Lugarda with divine mercy? I wished, therefore, to treat it as an illusion, and sought for reasons in support of this idea. But I found, on the contrary, that the reality of the apparition is admitted by the gravest authors, and that it is not rejected by a single one. Moreover, the biographer Thomas de Kentempre is very explicit, and at the same time very reserved. Quote, "Remark, reader," unquote. He writes at the end of his narrative, quote, "that it was from the mouth of the pious Lugarda herself that I heard of the faults revealed by the defunct, and which I admit here through respect for so great a pope." Unquote. Aside from this, considering the event in itself, can we find any good reason for calling it into question? Do we not know that God makes no exception of persons, that the popes appear before his tribunal like the humblest of the faithful, that all the great and the lowly are equal before him, and that each one receives according to his works? Do we not know that those who govern others have a great responsibility, and will have to render a severe account? Judicum durissimum qui presunt fiat. Quote, "A most severe judgment shall be for them that bear rule." Unquote. It is the Holy Ghost that declares it. Now, Innocent III reigned for 18 years and during most turbulent times. And, add the Bollandists, it is not written that the judgment of gods are inscrutable, and very often very different from the judgments of men. The reality of this apparition cannot, then, be reasonably called in question. I see no reason for omitting it, since God does not reveal mysteries of his nature for any other purpose than that they should be made known for the edification of his church. Pope Innocent III died July 16, 1216. The same day he appeared to Saint Lugarda in her monastery at Iwers in Brabant. Surprised to see a spectre enveloped in flames, she asked who he was and what he wanted. "I am Pope Innocent," he replied. Quote, "Is it possible that you, our common father, should be in such a state?" Unquote. Quote, "It is but too true. I am expiating 3 faults which might have caused my eternal perdition. Thanks to the Blessed Virgin Mary, I have obtained pardon for them, but I have to make atonement. Alas, it is terrible, and it will last for centuries if you do not come to my assistance. In the name of Mary, who has obtained for me the favor of appealing to you, help me." Unquote. With these words he disappeared. Lutgarda announced the Pope's death to her sisters, and together they betook themselves to prayer and penitential work on behalf of the august and venerated pontiff, whose demise was communicated to them some weeks later from another source. Let us add here a more consoling fact, which we find in the life of the same saint. A celebrated preacher named John de Lire was a man of great piety and well known to our saint. He made a contract with her, by which they mutually promised that the one who should die first, with the permission of God, should appear to the other. John was the first to depart this life. Having undertaken a journey to Rome for the arrangement of certain affairs in the interest of the religious, he met his death among the Alps. Faithful to his promise, he appeared to Lutgarda in the celebrated cloister of Iwers. On seeing him, the saint had not the slightest idea that he was dead, and invited him, according to the rule, to enter the parlor that she might converse with him. Quote, "I am no more of this world," unquote, he replied. Quote, "And I come here only in fulfillment of my promise," unquote. At these words, Lutgarda fell on her knees and remained for some time confounded. Then, raising her eyes to her blessed friend, she said, quote, "Why are you clothed in such splendor? What does this triple robe signify in which I see you adorned?" Unquote. Quote, "The white garment," he replied, "signifies virginal purity, which I have always preserved. The red tunic implies the labors and sufferings which have prematurely exhausted my strength, and the blue mantle, which covers all, denotes the perfection of the spiritual life." Unquote. Having said these words, he suddenly left Lutgarda, who remained divided between regret for having lost so good a father and the joy she experienced on account of his happiness. Saint Vincent Ferrer, the celebrated wonder-worker of the Order of St. Dominic, who preached with so much eloquence and the great truth of the judgment of God, had a sister who remained unmoved either by the words or example of her saintly brother. She was full of the spirit of the world, intoxicated with its pleasures, and walked with rapid strides towards her eternal ruin. Meanwhile, the saint prayed for her conversion, and his prayer was finally answered. The unfortunate sinner fell mortally sick, and at the moment of death entered into herself. She made her confession with sincere repentance. Some days after her death, while her brother was celebrating the holy sacrifice, she appeared to him in the midst of flames and a prey to the most intolerable torments. Said she, quote, "Alas, my dear brother, I am condemned to undergo these torments until the day of the last judgment. Nevertheless, you can assist me. The efficacy of the holy sacrifice is so great. Offer for me about 30 masses that I may hope the happiest result." The saint hastened to accede to her request, He celebrated the 30 Masses, and on the 30th day his sister again appeared to him surrounded by angels and soaring to heaven. Thanks to the virtue of the divine sacrifice, an expiation of several centuries was reduced to 30 days. This example shows us at once the duration of the pains in which a soul may occur, and the powerful effect of the holy sacrifice of the Mass, when God is pleased to apply it to a soul. But this application, like all other suffrages, do not always take place, at least not always in the same plenitude. Chapter 24. Duration of Purgatory, the Dualist, Father Schoofs, and the Apparition at Antwerp. The following example shows not only the long duration of the punishment inflicted for certain faults, but also the difficulty of inclining divine justice in favor of those who have committed faults of his nature. The history of the Order of the Visitation mentions, among the first religious of that institute, Sister Marie Denise, called in the world Mademoiselle Marie Martignant. She was most charitably devoted to the souls in purgatory and felt herself particularly drawn to recommend to God in a special manner those who had held high positions in the world, for she knew by experience the dangers which their position exposed them. A certain prince, whose name is not given, but who it is believed belonged to the House of France, was killed in a duel, and God permitted him to appear to Sister Denise to ask of her the assistance with which he stood so greatly in need. He told her that he was not damned, although his crime merited damnation. Thanks to an act of perfect contrition, which he had made at the moment of death, he had been saved. But in punishment for his guilty life and death, he was condemned to the most rigorous chastisement in purgatory until the day of judgment. The charitable sister, deeply touched by the state of this soul, generously offered herself as a victim for him, but it is impossible to say what she had to suffer for many years in consequence of that heroic act. The poor prince left her no repose, and made her partake in his torments. She completed her sacrifice by death, but before expiring she confided to her superior that, in return for so much expiation, she had obtained for her protégé the remission of but a few hours of pain. When the superior expressed her astonishment at this result, which seemed to her entirely disproportionate with what the sister had suffered, Sister Denise replied, quote, "Ah, my dear mother, in the hours of purgatory are not computed like those on earth. Years of grief, weariness, poverty, and sickness in this world are nothing compared to 1 hour of the suffering of purgatory. It is already much in that divine mercy permits us to exercise any influence whatever over his justice. I am less moved by the lamentable state in which I have seen this soul languish, other than by the extraordinary return of grace which has consummated the work of his salvation. The act in which the prince died merited hell. 1,000,000 others might have found their eternal perdition in the same act in which he found his salvation. He recovered consciousness, but for one instant, just time sufficient to cooperate with that precious movement of grace which disposed him to make an act of perfect contrition. That blessed moment seemed to me to be in excess of the goodness, clemency, and infinite love of God." Thus spoke Sister Denise. She admired at once the severity of God's justice and his infinite mercy. Both one and the same shone forth in his example in the most striking manner. Continuing the subject of long duration of purgatory, we will here relate an instance of more recent occurrence. Father Philip Schoofs, of the Company of Jesus, who died in Louvain in 1878, related the following fact, which happened in Antwerp during the first years of his ministry in that city. He had just preached a mission, and had returned to the College of Notre Dame, then situated in the Rue Empereur, when he was told someone asked for him in the parlor. Descending immediately, he found there 2 young men in the flower of their age, with a pale and sickly child of about 10 years. Said they, quote, "Father, here is a poor child that we have adopted, and who deserves our protection because he is good and pious. We feed and educate him, and, for more than a year that he has formed part of our family, he has been happy and enjoyed good health. It is only for the last few weeks that he has commenced to grow thin and pine away, as you now see him." Unquote. Quote, "What is the cause of this change?" Unquote, asked the father. They replied, quote, "It is fright. The child is awakened every night by apparitions. A man, he assures us, presents himself before him, and he sees him as distinctly as he sees us in full daylight. This is the cause of his continual fear and uneasiness. We come, Father, to ask of you some remedy." Close quote. Quote, "My friends," unquote, replied Father Schufs, quote, "with God there is a remedy for all things. Begin, both of you, by making a good confession and communion. Beg God to deliver you from all evil and fear nothing. As for you, my child, say your prayers well, then sleep so soundly that no ghost can awake you." He then dismissed them, telling them to return in any case more than should happen. 2 weeks had passed, and they again returned. Quote, "Father," unquote, said they, quote, "we have followed your orders, and yet the apparitions continue as before. The child always sees the same man appear." Unquote. Father Schufs said, quote, "From this evening, watch at the door of the child's room, provided with paper and ink into which to write the answers. When he warns you of the presence of that man, ask in the name of God who he is, the time of his death, where he lived, and why he returns." Unquote. The following day they returned, carrying the paper on which was written the answers they had received. They said, quote, "We saw the man that appears to the child." Unquote. They described him as an old man, of whom they could but see the bust, and he wore a costume of olden times. He told them his name and the house in which he had dwelt in Antwerp. He had died in 1636, had followed the profession of banker in the same house, which in his time comprised of the 2 houses which today may be seen situated on the right and left of it. Let us remark here that certain documents which prove the accuracy of these indications have since been discovered in the archives of the city of Antwerp. He added that he was in Purgatory, and that a few prayers had been said for him. He then begged the persons of the house to offer Holy Communion with him, and finally asked that a pilgrimage might be made to him to Notre Dame de Fèvres and another to Notre Dame de la Chapelle in Brussels. Quote, "You do well to comply with all these requests," unquote, said Father Schufs. Quote, "And if the spirit returns before speaking to him, require him to say the Pater, Ave, and Credo." Unquote. They accomplished the good works indicated with all possible piety, and many conversions were effected. When all was finished, the young men returned. Quote, "Father, he prayed," unquote, they said to Father Schufs, but in a tone of indescribable faith and piety. We had never heard anyone pray thus. What reverence in the Our Father, what love in the Hail Mary, what fervor in the I believe. Now we know what it is to pray. Then we thanked us for our prayers. He was greatly relieved, and we should have been entirely delivered had not an assistant in our shop made a sacrilegious communion. We have, quote, reported these words to the person. She turned pale, acknowledged her guilt, then running to her confessor, hastened to repair her crime. Unquote. Since that day, unquote, adds Father Schufs, quote, that house has never been troubled. The family that inhabit it have prospered rapidly, and today they are rich. The two brothers continue to conduct themselves in an exemplary manner, and their sister became a religious in a convent, of which she is at the present time superior, unquote. Everything leads us to believe that the prosperity of the family was the result of the succor given to the departed soul. After 2 centuries of punishment, there remained to the latter but a small part of the expiation and the performance of some good works, which he asked. And when these were accomplished, he was delivered and wished to show his gratitude by obtaining the blessings of God upon his benefactors. Chapter 25. Duration of Purgatory. The Abbey of La Trobe, 100 years of suffering for delay in the reception of the last sacraments. The following incident is related with authentic proof by the journal Du Monde in the number of April 1860. It took place in America, at the Abbey of the Benedictines, situated in the village of La Trobe. A series of apparitions occurred during the course of the year 1859. The American press took up the matter and treated those grave questions with its usual levity. In order to put a stop to scandal, the Abbot Wimmer, superior of the house, addressed the following letter to the newspapers. Quote, the following is a true statement of our case. In our Abbey of St. Vincent, near La Trobe, on September 10th, 1859, a novice saw an apparition of a Benedictine in full choir dress. The apparition was repeated every day from December 18th till November 19th, either at 11 o'clock at noon or 2 o'clock in the morning. It was only on the 19th of November that the novice interrogated the spirit in presence of another member of the community and asked the motive for these apparitions. He replied that he had suffered for 77 years for having neglected to celebrate 7 masses of obligation. He had already appeared at different times to 7 other Benedictines, but that he had not been heard, and that he would be obliged to appear again after 11 years if the novice did not come to his assistance. Finally, the spirit asked that these 7 masses might be celebrated for him. Moreover, the novice must remain in retreat for 7 days, keep strict silence, and during 30 days recite 3 times a day the psalm Miserere, his feet bare and his arms extended in the form of a cross. All the conditions were fulfilled between November 20th and December 25th, and on the day after the celebration of the last Mass, the apparition disappeared. During that period, the spirit showed itself several times, exhorting the novice in the most urgent manner to pray for the souls in purgatory. For, said he, they suffer frightfully and are extremely grateful to those who cooperate in their deliverance. He added, sad to relate, that of the 5 priests who had died in our abbey, not one had yet entered heaven. All were suffering in purgatory. I do not draw any conclusion, but this is correct." Unquote. This account, signed by the hand of the abbot, is an incontestable historical document. As regards the conclusion which the venerable prelate leaves us to draw, it is evident. Seeing that a religious is condemned to purgatory for 77 years, let it suffice for us to learn the necessity on reflecting on the duration of future punishment, as well as for priests and religious, as for the faithful living in the midst of the corruption of the world. A too frequent cause of the long continuance of purgatory is that many deprive themselves of a great means established by Jesus Christ for shortening it, by delaying, when dangerously sick, to receive the last sacraments. These sacraments, destined to prepare souls for their last journey, to purify them from the remains of sin, and to spare them the pains of the other life, require, in order to produce their effects, that the sick person receive them with the requisite dispositions. Now the longer they are deferred and the faculties of the sick person allowed to become weak, the more defective do these dispositions become. What do I say? Very often it happens, in consequence of this imprudent delay, that the sick person dies deprived of this absolutely necessary help. The result is that if the deceased is not damned, he is plunged into the deepest abysses of purgatory, loaded with all the weight of his debts. Michael Alex speaks of a ecclesiastic who, instead of promptly receiving the supreme unction, and therein giving a good example to the faithful, was guilty of negligence in this respect, and was punished by 100 years of purgatory. Knowing that he was seriously ill and in danger of death, this poor priest should have made known his condition, and immediately had recourse to the succors which the Mother Church reserves for her children in that supreme hour. He omitted to do so, and, whether through an illusion common among sick people, he would not declare the gravity of his situation, or whether he was under the influence of that fatal prejudice which causes weak Christians to defer the reception of the last sacraments, he neither asked for nor thought of receiving them. But we know how death comes by stealth. The unfortunate man deferred so long that he died without having had time to receive either the viaticum or extreme unction. Now, God was pleased to make use of this circumstance to give a great warning to others. The deceased himself came to make known to a brother ecclesiastic that he was condemned to purgatory for 100 years. Quote, "I am thus punished," unquote, he said, quote, "for delaying to receive the grace of the last purification. Had I received the sacraments, as I ought to have done, I should have escaped death through the virtue of extreme unction, and should have had time to do penance." Chapter 26. Duration of Purgatory. Venerable Catherine Paluzzi and Sister Bernardine, Brothers Finette and Rudolfine, St. Peter Claver, and the two poor women. Let us cite some other examples which will serve to convince us still more of the long duration of the sufferings of purgatory. We shall see therein that divine justice is relatively severe towards souls called to perfection and who have received much grace. Does not Jesus Christ say in the Gospels, "Unto whom much is given, of him shall much be required, and to whom they have committed much, of him they will demand the more"? We read in the life of Venerable Catherine Paluzzi that a holy religious who died in her arms was not admitted to eternal beatitude until after she had passed an entire year in purgatory. Catherine Paluzzi led a holy life in the Diocese of Nepi in Italy, where she founded a convent of Dominicans. There lived with her a religious named Bernardine, who was far advanced in the ways of the spiritual life. These two saints emulated each other in fervor and helped each other to progress more and more in the perfection to which God called them. The biographer of Venerable Catherine compares them to two live coals that communicate heat to each other, and again to two harps tuned to harmonize together in one perpetual hymn of love to the greater glory of God. Bernardine died. A painful malady, in which she bore with Christian patience, carried her to the grave. When about to expire, she told Catherine that she would not forget her before God, and if God so permitted, she would return to converse with her on such spiritual matters as would contribute to her sanctification. Catherine prayed much for the soul of her friend, and at the same time besought God to allow her to appear to her. An entire year elapsed, and the deceased did not return. Finally, on the anniversary of the death of Bernardine, Catherine, being in prayer, saw a pit from whence issued volumes of smoke and flames. Then she perceived coming out of the pit a form surrounded by dark clouds. By degrees these vapors were dispersed, and the apparition became radiant with an extraordinary brilliancy. In this glorious personage, Catherine recognized Bernardine and ran towards her. Quote, "It is you, my dearest sister," unquote, said she. Quote, "But whence do you come? What signifies this pit, this fiery smoke? Does your purgatory end to only today?" Unquote. Replied the soul, quote, "You are right. For a year I have been detained in that place of expiation, and today, for the first time, I shall enter heaven. As regards yourself, persevere in your holy exercises. Continue to be charitable and merciful, and you will obtain mercy." The following incident belongs to the history of the Society of Jesus. Two scholastics or young religious of the Institute, Brothers Finetti and Rudolfini, pursued their studies at the Roman college towards the end of the 16th century. Both were models of piety and regularity. Both also received a warning from heaven, which they disclosed, according to the rule, to their spiritual director. God made known to them their approaching death and the suffering that awaited them in purgatory. One was to remain there for 2 years, the other 4. They died, in fact, one after the other. Their brethren in religion immediately offered the most fervent prayers and all kinds of penances for the repose of their souls. They knew that if the sanctity of God imposes long expiations upon his elect, that they may be abridged and entirely remitted by the suffrages of the living. If God is severe towards those who have received much knowledge and grace, on the other hand, he is very indulgent towards the poor and the simple, provided they serve him with sincerity and patience. St. Peter Claver, of the Company of Jesus, apostle of the Negroes of Carthagena, knew of the purgatory of 2 souls who had led poor and humble lives upon earth. Their sufferings were reduced to a few hours. We find the following account of it in the life of this great servant of God. He had persuaded a virtuous negress named Angela to take into her house another negress named Ursula, who had lost the use of her limbs and was covered with sores. One day when he went to visit him, as he did from time to time, to hear their confessions and to carry them some little provisions, the charitable hostess told him with grief that Ursula was at the point of death. "No, no," replied the father, consoling her. "She has yet 4 days to live, and she will not die until Saturday." When Saturday came, he said Mass for her intention and went out to prepare her for death. After spending some time in prayer, he said to the hostess with an air of confidence, "Be consoled. God loves Ursula. She will die today, but she will only be 3 hours in purgatory. Let her remember me when she shall be with God, that she may pray for me and for the one who until now had been a mother to her." She died at noon, and the fulfillment of one part of the prophecy gave a great reason for belief in the accomplishment of the other. Another day, having gone to hear the confession of a poor sick person whom he was accustomed to visit, he learned that she was dead. The parents were extremely afflicted, and he himself, who had not believed her to be so near her end, was inconsolable at the thought of not having been able to assist her in her last moments. He knelt down to pray by the corpse, when suddenly rising with a serene countenance, he said, Such a death is more worthy of our envy than of our tears. This soul is condemned to purgatory, but only for 24 hours. Let us endeavor to shorten this time by the fervor of our prayers. Enough has been said on the duration of the pains. We see that they may be prolonged to an appalling degree. Even the shortest, if we consider their severity, are long. Let us endeavor to shorten them for others and to mitigate them for ourselves, or better still, to prevent them altogether. Now we prevent them by removing the causes. What are the causes? What is the matter of expiation in purgatory? Chapter 27. The cause of suffering. The matter of the expiations of purgatory. The doctrine of Suarez. St. Catherine of Genoa. Why must souls thus suffer before being admitted to see the face of God? What is the matter? What is the subject of these expiations? What has the fire of purgatory to purify, to consume in them? It is to say, the doctors, the stains left by their sins. But what is here understood by stains? According to most theologians, it is not the guilt of sin, but the pain or the debt of pain proceeding from sin. To understand this well, we must remember that sin produces a double effect on the soul, which we call the debt, riatus, of guilt and the debt of pain. It renders the soul not only guilty, but deserving of pain or chastisement. Now, after the guilt is pardoned, it has generally happened that the pain remains to be undergone, either entirely or in part, and this must be endured either in the present life or in the life to come. The souls in purgatory retain not the slightest stain of guilt. The venial guilt which they had at the moment of their death had disappeared in the order of pure charity with which they are inflamed in the other life, but they still bear the debt of suffering which they had not discharged before death. This debt proceeds from all the faults committed during their life, especially from mortal sins remitted as to guilt, but which they have neglected to expiate by worthy fruits of exterior penance. Such is the common teaching of theologians, which Suarez sums up in his treatise on the sacrament of penance. He says, quote, "We conclude, then, that all venial sins with which a just man dies are remitted as to the guilt at the moment when the soul is separated from the body by virtue of an act of love of God and the perfect contrition which then excites all over its past faults. In fact, the soul at this moment knows its condition perfectly, and the sins of which it had been guilty before God. At the same time, it is the mistress of its faults to be able to act. On the other hand, on the part of God, the most efficacious helps are given to her, that she may not, according to the measure of sanctifying grace which she possesses. It follows, then, that in this perfect disposition, the soul acts without the least hesitation. It turns directly to its God, and finds itself freed from all venial sins by an act of sovereign loathing of sin. This universal and efficacious act suffices for the remission of their guilt. All stain of guilt has then disappeared, but the pain remains to be endured in all its vigor and long duration, at least for those souls that are not assisted by the living. They cannot obtain the least relief for themselves, because the time of merit has passed. They can no longer merit, they can but suffer, and in this way pay to the terrible justice of God that they owe even to the last farthing. These debts of pain are the remains of sin, and a kind of stain which intercepts the vision of God and places an obstacle to the union of the soul in its last end. Since the soul in purgatory are freed from the guilt of sin, writes St. Catherine of Genoa, There is no other barrier between them and their union with God save the remains of sin, from which they must be purified. This hindrance which they feel within them causes them to suffer the torments of the damned, of which I have spoken elsewhere, and retards the moment when the instinct by which they are drawn towards God as to their sovereign beatitude will attain its full perfection. They see clearly how serious before God is even the slightest obstacle raised by the remains of sin, and that is by necessity of justice that he delays the full gratification of their desire of everlasting bliss. This sight enkindles within them a burning flame, like that of hell, yet without the guilt of sin. Chapter 28. The matter of expiation, the remains of mortal sin, Lord Stourton, sins of lust not fully expiated upon earth, Saint Lidwina. We have said that the total amount of the debt of suffering for purgatory comes from all the faults not atoned for upon the earth, but especially from mortal sins remitted to their guilt. Now men who pass their whole lives in a habitual state of mortal sin, and who delay their conversion until death, supposing that God grants them that rare grace, will have to undergo the most frightful punishment. The example of Lord Stourton gives them good cause for reflection. Lord Stourton, an English nobleman, was at heart a Catholic, although to retain his position at court he regularly attended the Protestant service. He kept a Catholic priest concealed in his house, at the risk of great danger, promising himself to make good use of his ministry by being reconciled with God at the hour of his death. But he met with a sudden accident, and, as often happens in such cases, by a just degree of God, he had not the time to realize his desire of tardy conversion. Nevertheless, divine mercy, taking into consideration what he had done for the persecuted Catholic Church in England, vouchsafed him the grace of perfect contrition and consequently secured his salvation, but he had to pay dearly for his culpable negligence. Years passed. His widow married again and had children. It was one of her daughters, Lady Arundel, who relates this fact as an eyewitness. Quote, "One day my mother asked Father Cornelius, a Jesuit of much merit, who later died a martyr, to say Mass for the repose of the soul of John, Lord Stourton, her first husband. He promised to do so, and whilst at the altar between the consecration and the memento for the dead, he paused for a long time as if absorbed in prayer. After Mass, in an exhortation to which he addressed those present, he told them of a vision which he had just had during the Holy Sacrifice. He had seen an immense forest stretched out before him, but entirely on fire, forming one vast cauldron. In the midst of it was the deceased nobleman, uttering lamentable cries, bewailing the guilty life he had led in the world and at court. Having made a full confession of his faults, the unfortunate man ended with these words, which Holy Scripture places in the mouth of Job: "Have pity on me. Have pity on me, at least, you my friends, for the hand of the Lord hath touched me." He then disappeared. Whilst relating this, Father Cornelius shed an abundance of tears, and we all, members of his family, to the number of 24 persons, wept also. Suddenly, whilst the Father was still speaking, we perceived upon the wall against which the altar stood what seemed to be the reflection of burning coals. Such is the recital of Dorothy, Lady Arundel, which may be read in the History of England by Daniel. Saint Lidwina saw in Purgatory a soul that suffered also for mortal sins not sufficiently expiated on earth. The incident is thus related in the life of the saint, a man who had been for a long time a slave of the demon of impurity, finally had the happiness of being converted. He confessed his sins with great contrition, but, prevented by death, he had not the time to atone by just penance for his numerous sins. Lidwina, who knew him well, prayed much for him. 12 years after his death, she still continued to pray, when, in one of her ecstasies, being taken into purgatory by her angel guardian, he heard a mournful voice issuing from a deep pit. Quote, "It is the soul of that man," unquote, said the angel, quote, "for you have prayed with so much fervor and constancy," unquote. She was astonished to find him so deep in purgatory 12 years after his death. The angel, seeing her so greatly affected, asked if she was willing to suffer something for his deliverance. Quote, "With all my heart," unquote, replied the charitable maiden. From that moment she suffered new pains and frightful torments which appeared to surpass the strength of human endurance. Nevertheless she bore them with courage, sustained by a charity stronger than death, until it pleased God to send her relief. She then breathed as one restored to a new life, and, at the same time, she saw that the soul for which she had suffered so much come forth from the abyss as white as snow and take its flight to heaven. Chapter 29. Matter of Expiation, Worldliness, Saint Bridget, the Young Person, the Soldier, Blessed Mary Villani, and the Worldly Lady. Souls that allow themselves to be dazzled by the vanities of the world, even if they have good fortune to escape damnation, will have to undergo terrible punishment. Let us open the Revelations of St. Bridget, which are held in much esteem by the Church. We read there in Book 6 that the saint saw herself transported in spirit into purgatory, and that, among others, she saw there a young lady of high birth who had formerly abandoned herself to the luxury and the vanities of the world. This unfortunate soul related to her the history of her life and the sad state in which she then was. She said, quote, "Happily, before death I confessed my sins in such dispositions as to escape hell, but now I suffer here to expiate the worldly life that my mother did not prevent me from leading. Alas," unquote, she added with a sigh, quote, "this head, which loved to be adorned, and which was sought to draw the attention of others, is now devoured with flames within and without, and these flames are so violent that every moment it seems to me that I must die. These shoulders, these arms, which I love to see admired, are cruelly bound in chains of red-hot iron. These feet, formerly trained for the dance, are now surrounded with vipers that tear them with their fangs and soil them with their filthy slime. And all these members, of which I have adorned with jewels, flowers, and divers other ornaments, are now a prey to the most horrible torture. Oh, mother, mother," unquote, she cried, quote, "how culpable have you been in my regard? It was you who, by a fatal indulgence, encouraged my taste for display and extravagant expense. It was you that took me to the theaters, parties, and balls, and to those worldly assemblies which are the ruin of souls. If I have not incurred eternal damnation, it was because a special grace of God's mercy touched my soul with sincere repentance. I made a good confession, and thus I have been delivered from hell, yet only to see myself precipitated into the most horrible torments of purgatory." Unquote. We have remarked already that what is said of the tortured members must not be taken literally, because the soul is separated from the body. But God, supplying the want of corporal organs, makes the soul experience such sensations have been just described. The biographer of the saint tells us that she related this vision to a cousin of the deceased, who was likewise given to the illusions of worldly vanity. The cousin was so struck that she renounced the luxuries and dangerous amusements of the world and devoted the remainder of her life to penance in an austere religious order. The same Saint Bridget, during another ecstasy, beheld the judgment of a soldier who had just died. He had lived in the vices too common in his profession, and would have been condemned to hell had not the Blessed Virgin, whom he had always honored, preserved him from that misfortune by obtaining for him the grace of a sincere repentance. The saint saw him appear before the judgment seat of God and condemned to a long purgatory for the sins of all kinds which he had just committed. Quote, "The punishment of the eyes," unquote, said the judge, quote, "shall be to contemplate the most frightful objects, that of the tongue to be pierced with pointed needles and tormented with thirst, that of the touch to be plunged into an ocean of fire," unquote. Then the Holy Virgin interceded and obtained some mitigation of the rigor of the sentence. Let us relate still another example of the chastisements reserved for worldlings in purgatory, when they have not, like the rich glutton of the gospel, been buried in hell. Blessed Mary Villani, a Dominican religious, had a lively devotion to the holy souls, and it often happened that they appeared to her, either to thank her or to beg the assistance of her prayers and good works. One day, whilst praying for them with great fervor, she was transported in spirit to the prison of expiation. Among the souls that suffered there, she saw one more cruelly tormented than the others, in the midst of flames which entirely enveloped her. Touched with compassion, the servant of God interrogated the soul. She replied, quote, "I have been here for a very long time, punished for my vanity and my scandalous extravagance. Thus far I have not received the least alleviation. Whilst I was upon earth, being wholly occupied with my toilet, my pleasures, and worldly amusements, I thought very little of my duties as a Christian, and fulfilled them only with great reluctance and in a slothful manner. My only serious thought was to further the worldly interests of my family. I see now how I am punished. They bestow not so much as a passing thought upon me. My parents, my children, those friends with whom I was most intimate, all have forgotten me." Mary Villani begged this soul to allow her to feel some of what she suffered, and immediately it appeared as though a finger of the fire touched her forehead, and the pain which she experienced instantly caused her ecstasy to cease. The mark remained, and so deep and painful was it that 2 months afterwards it was still to be seen, and caused the holy religious most terrible suffering. She endured the pain in the spirit of penance for the relief of the soul that had appeared to her, and some time later the same soul came to announce her deliverance.